Hello and welcome to another interview with Father Thomas Esposito. He is a Cistercian priest from Our Lady of Dallas Cistercian Abbey, and we're going to bring him into the conversation in just a minute. My name is Dave Palmer, and thank you for being here to watch these interviews. Appreciate the comments or questions if you have any feedback about the kind of topics that we talk about. The broad topic of this interview is going to be, was Jesus a philosopher? Okay, when he walked the earth in his 33 years, can we consider him a philosopher, a theologian? What exactly was Jesus? And we're also going to go into the realm of St. Paul as well, the most prolific author of the New Testament. Was he a philosopher? Was philosophy on his mind? And so we welcome back Father Thomas Esposito. Thank you very much for being here again. Good to see you.
Likewise, Dave.
Same outfit?
I try to be consistent in my apparel choice.
Yeah, well, I'm wearing the same as well. So anyways, couple of kind of questions before we get started. Last interview, you mentioned your top three philosophers were Heraclitus, Blaise Pascal, and then the third one was,
Edith Stein. Yep.
Edith Stein, yeah, great doctor of the church. When you're not reading philosophy or even theology, because I know that's a big part of your life as a priest, what do you like to read? What's your pleasure reading, or authors or types of books?
There was a professor at my school in Rome before I was there, but there was a saying of his handed down. He encouraged his students to read novels as a way of preserving their imaginations in doing the dry, nitty-gritty work of biblical scholarship. They could very easily become dusty and desiccated in their minds. But novels allow them to remain sharp and to generate some sympathy for a character in a text. And so I try to read a novel continuously from one to the next. Some favorite novelists would be Charles Dickens, Dostoevsky. I just finished George Eliot's Middlemarch. I went on a Jane Austen kick about a year ago. Don't really recommend it, but it was worthwhile. I needed to do that.
Yeah. Any Shakespeare? Do you like him?
Oh, to be sure.
Yeah.
I haven't read a play of his in a little while, but I did go to a performance of a comedy of errors.
Yeah, that counts.
That counts.
Yeah, and very interesting. So the broad topic here is, was Jesus a philosopher? Okay, was that on his radar, so to speak, when he's traveling about Galilee and teaching, or strictly a theologian, or a little bit of both? And then we'll also segue into St. Paul as well. So I remember when I sent that to you in an email, you said, "Oh, that's an interesting concept," but I don't know if it really makes a difference if he was. So what's your basic answer to that question? Was Jesus interested in philosophy?
Probably not, if we're limiting philosophy to the Greeks.
Yeah.
He might not have ever heard the term philosophy, for all we know. He certainly does not appear to have engaged in disputes with any Greek-minded thinkers or pagans on the topic of Plato or Aristotle.
Yeah.
But I think we can properly refer to him as a philosopher. He's certainly a teacher. He's addressed as rabbi on numerous occasions. And he advocates a way of life, which in the original sense of the term philosophy, the love of wisdom, demands a morality and a purpose for which you are going through life. And so in that etymological sense, I think absolutely he counts as a philosopher.
Yeah.
We don't always think of him in that regard because he is so rightly renowned for his theological insights and the relation to the Father and the sending of the Holy Spirit and whatnot.
Yeah. He didn't seem to be too interested in, like Aquinas, the five proofs of the existence of God. He didn't seem to be like in an apologetic mode that God does exist. Well, because he is God, right? And it doesn't seem like in that same kind of philosophical reasoning out that there's a God. It was more he just kind of wanted to reveal the Father, right, and through himself, and so that would not really fall into the realm of philosophy. It'd be more theology, right?
Correct. Jesus was born into a Jewish matrix of faith and culture, and God is a given for the Jewish people. It's their unique relationship and status to be the particular people of God, whom God has chosen to enter into a covenant with. That's assumed in Jesus' own ministry and in the writings of the Old Testament. So the dialectical analysis of being and divinity doesn't enter into his framework. Mm-hmm. He's on the earth to reveal the full nature of God and the true nature of humanity. So in that sense, absolutely, he qualifies as the most eminent philosopher. But he does not write treatises or Platonic dialogues on the subject of the
Didn't
soul.
write anything.
Didn't write anything as far as we know.
So if the human being, according to my Thomistic training, has a certain nature, and we can get so far with our human nature and come to know certain things, like that there is a God, but not much about him. But then we have to be lifted up above our nature to achieve our final end, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where maybe sacred doctrine. So last interview I gave the example of the Venn diagram, where we are human beings, you and I, natural, but we can be lifted up beyond our nature, right? Sure. Through grace. But Jesus, I don't know. I'm still working on that kind of Venn diagram of Jesus being the philosophy and theology all wrapped up into one, person. Has any other person posited that, or does that make any sense, or what do you think of that?
I think that's the Catholic way of understanding faith and reason.
Yeah.
They wouldn't be separated in independent circles without ever touching each other. Right? There is definitely an element of reason that is required for us to make the ascent of faith to things that we could not develop on our own or come to on our own. To my mind, at least right now, I'm thinking of John 14:6, where Jesus calls himself the way, the truth, and the life. I think there, in one aspect, you have the bridge between faith and reason, between philosophy and theology.
The way, the truth, and life, yeah.
If philosophy is a way of life, and the pursuit of wisdom is the pursuit of truth and goodness and beauty, well, Jesus describes himself and devotion to him as the way in which not only you come to your proper end as a human being, your supernatural end, but you also fully flourish as a human being.
Yeah. Among the gospel writers, we'll get to St. Paul here in a moment, but among the gospel writers, you've got the synoptics writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who are very similar in their style, and then John comes along, and he's very different. And I know you're going to comment on the prologue of John's gospel, and maybe its connection to some of the Greek, the philosophers. Yeah. But was John more philosophical than the others? Would that be an accurate statement, do you think, in his gospel?
I think without doubt, all you have to do is read the opening lines of each of the Gospels to get their particular vantage point or bent on the story of Jesus. Mark was probably the least educated among the evangelists. He begins his Gospel with, "I'm starting the Gospel of Jesus. Let's go." Matthew begins with the genealogy of Jesus' line because he wants particularly to emphasize Jesus' Jewish roots. Luke perhaps was the most educated of the evangelists, and he very consciously styles himself as a Hellenistic Greek historian in presenting the evidence in the opening verses of his gospel and his method of recounting the deeds and words of Jesus. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't have the philosophical mind that John does. Because in the prologue of John, you have those famous opening words. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Word was God. What we translate in English as capital W, Word, in Greek is logos. So for John, what he does in the prologue is this amazing blend of Hellenistic Greek philosophy and Jewish theology. In the beginning is going to make a Jewish reader instantly think of Genesis.
Yeah, Genesis, yeah.
All things came to be through the word of God, who speaks everything into being, right? Let there be light, and so there was light. John has his Jewish readers on board at that point, but he also gets his Greek readers on board with the idea of logos, because Heraclitus, one of my faves, and Plato, and Stoic philosophers all spoke of the logos essentially as God.
Mm-hmm.
This great mind who has ordered everything in a beautiful way. And it's from those created things that we perceive and a beauty to the cosmos that we can reason back to a creator. So John takes Genesis 1 and this Greek idea of logos and says, I'm going to tell you about him. Mm-hmm. All things came to be through this logos, and without him nothing came to be. And he's following, or he has a following with the Greeks up until verse 14, when he says, and the logos is no longer just mind who speaks order into being, but the logos became flesh at a certain point in history and made his dwelling among us, literally pitched his tent among us.
Yeah.
And right there you have the great revolution. We're not talking about Heraclitus' logos at this point. We're talking about Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And so it's the great synthesis that John makes between Jewish theology and Greek philosophy in explaining the mystery of Jesus' supernatural origins.
Now, would it be too much of a stretch to say that there are shadows of like the universal form of Plato, the whole kind of form matter, relationship, and I know that Plato and Aristotle didn't agree with that, where Plato had a more denigrated view of matter. And as you say that about verse 14, it seems like that might have even been a little controversial, where something so ideal, so pure, all of a sudden, whoa, you're introducing...
Get stuck in the muck of matter.
Yeah, you're getting introduced to matter. Am I taking this too far, or do you think there's something there?
No, I think there's definitely something there. That verse, to my mind, allowed the first Christians to realize that they couldn't be Gnostics and be authentic Christians at the same time, because there is a goodness to the material world. It was good enough for God to enter into it in that radical and intimate way of becoming a human being. So that understanding of the incarnation automatically excludes any denigration of matter, any sense that the material world was created by an evil demiurge who's the God of the Old Testament, whereas Jesus Christ represents the God of the New Testament. That's how some Gnostic thinkers worked in the early church. The name Marcion comes to mind, and Valentinus. But they were wrong. And the basis for explaining why they were wrong was already in John's Gospel.
Yeah. So would this play into the different camps of philosophy, where we have the rationalists and the empiricists and the materialists, and Dr. Howell in a recent interview was talking about the physicalists, and there's all these ists, and where some people would go too far with just the reason, and some people too far with just the matter, and like you said, to be purely Catholic is to be sacramental, where really the two. Really, I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud as and kind of digesting what you said. Very interesting. Anything else about John? Because I want to move on to Paul. You mentioned Paul a little bit in the last interview about the Areopagus.
Sure.
And, maybe we can briefly talk about that. And then, was Paul a philosopher? Is that something that he was very well educated, right? At the feet of Gamaliel, so he would have been a very bright Jewish rabbi, basically, right?
Yes. He grew up in Tarsus, which is, I think, on the border of modern-day Syria and Turkey, and it was a cosmopolitan city. So he certainly knew Greek. He wrote it in his New Testament letters, and I think he was familiar with the basic currents of many schools of Greek thought. In some of his letters, such as Galatians, he'll make lists of virtues and vices that parallel lists that we have in Stoic writers about the virtues and vices that lead one to proper understanding of philosophy and away from it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he had a very philosophical mind. But again, he was thoroughly immersed in the Jewish world. He was a Pharisee. He calls himself that in Acts and in his letter to the Philippians. And so of primary import for him is not philosophy itself as a form or as a way of life, but the full understanding of what God has been up to in salvation history.
Yeah.
And the great revolution for Saul is his encounter not with mind or the Greek way of being, but with the risen Christ on the road to Damascus.
Yeah.
And that totally revolutionizes his life.
And some very practical teaching about marriage and, you know, how people act in church. And I mean, there's just some very practical relationship to authorities and stuff like that. So he kind of touched on a lot, didn't he, in his writings. Okay, so anything else about St. Paul? Because he wrote so many different letters. His basic goal seemed to be very Christological, right? Would you say, to explain who Christ was to people, sometimes getting a little feisty with like the Galatians.
To be sure, Paul was
very much about the law, and
Paul was an absolute choleric, sanguine fellow. I mean, he told it like it was. This is always sobering for me to ponder. He is the first Christian author. As far as we know, it's his letters that are the first pieces of Christian literature.
Oh, wow.
So he's literally creating Christian theology in founding these churches at different cities, such as Philippi and Thessalonica and Corinth and Ephesus. But he's creating community. And so he's understanding the Christian mystery that's just been revealed to him while shaping a group of ragtag believers and instilling in them a way of life. So in that sense, Paul himself was a Christian philosopher, without doubt, and all Christians after him are philosophers in that sense of pursuing wisdom.
And the average person that he spoke to in Thessalonica or Corinth or Rome, or where he wrote letters and visited, they would have been relatively knowledgeable about Greek philosophy and, of course, Roman culture. I mean, was it a pretty the names that Plato and Aristotle and Socrates would have been familiar to most of his audience, would you say?
I would tend to doubt that.
Yeah. In
1 Corinthians 1, he speaks of the Corinthians as basically the unimportant, irrelevant people of the world who weren't wise.
Yeah. Just kind of like Peter and the apostles, just kind of basic fishermen, right?
And I don't think we fully appreciate how rare literacy was in the ancient world.
Yeah.
Even an empire as sophisticated as the Romans had at most 10% of the population being capable of reading and writing.
Probably only men at that time.
Presumably, it would be rare for a woman to be educated in that way.
Yeah, interesting.
But,
okay.
But no, I think Paul's group was not the cream of the philosophical crop.
Interesting. All right. Okay, so I want to transition into just what I call scatter shooting. I'm going to throw out a name of a philosopher and just tell me your basic thoughts on them, maybe whether you like their philosophy, whether you think it's rubbish, whether there's anything that we could glean from, no, they're not. Any philosopher would have something probably that we could take. So we've talked a lot about Plato and Aristotle and the Greeks, so I'll leave them alone. Let's Descartes. What I think, therefore I am. Basic thoughts on him. What do you think?
He's the game changer in modern philosophy, and so some people see him as the great bogeyman to explain why everything went downhill in the modern world, from the heights of scholasticism to...
You don't subscribe to that theory?
I see how a certain pattern emerges after Descartes, because he does have a fundamentally different understanding of the mind, which ultimately creates the mind-body problem for contemporary neuroscience and philosophy.
So he started it.
He starts it in a way because he moves away from formal and final ends in the Aristotelian sense of teleology, of a purpose to one's life and a nature that informs beings.
Yeah.
Descartes moves away from that and focuses only on the senses, right? What can be perceived and measured. And that eventually does lead to a sense that only the senses give us any truth whatsoever. And whatever is outside of the senses is immaterial or irrelevant. But in his own lifetime, I mean, Descartes was a believer in God. He had a proof for the existence of God. And what he cannot doubt in his own experience, it is what leads him to the statement, I think, therefore I am. That's correct. Mm-hmm. And as long as you complement it with Paul's understanding of being thought by God in Galatians 4 and 1 Corinthians, I forget the chapter, you have, I think, a proper synthesis.
Mm. Do you think there's a pressure back then to kind of, I know the church, you see, like the Galileo episode, where there was a reluctance to, counter the church. And do you think that a guy like Descartes was afraid of even appearing to maybe go against, scholastic, Thomistic philosophy, or else there could be some repercussions? Do you think that was kind of in the air back then, where maybe a reluctance to release findings, whether they're right or wrong?
I don't think Descartes was worried in that sense. I think he knew exactly what he was doing and was willing to go along with it.
All right. The empiricists, like Berkeley, David Hume, did you study them, or what were your thoughts on them?
A little bit, way back in the day. I mean, I think Hume is the great hero for Kant, and you can do a certain lineage of philosophers down to the present day. I think Hume mistakes logic for the entirety of truth, and that causes him to have a very distorted understanding of the human person. Yeah. Quite simply.
Yeah, you mentioned Kant. I have asked so many people. Kant fascinates me. I know he's complicated, and Copernican revolution in philosophy and the categorical imperative and all that, but I don't know that I totally understand what he was getting at. My understanding is he was trying to find some kind of resolution between the rationalists and the empiricists. And what did he say? Something about Hume woke him from his slumber, or
from his dogmatic slumber.
Dogmatic slumber. So, explain Kant's maybe epistemology, or what was he getting at?
In a
he's
minute,
very
in a minute or less.
You can take a minute and a half, okay? Since we're talking about Kant, what was he getting at?
I am not the person to summarize Kant in an exact way, but I'll just fire from the hip. Kant's goal was to bring enlightenment to a level that would reduce faith to the realm of opinion and superstition. And he did that by arguing for what ultimately would be called idealism. And in the sense that our ideas, our understanding of cause and effect, that's what he gets from Hume. The very notions we have of what truth is, what is right, what can be measured, are all generated by the mind, in a sense. Yeah. And so he really turns philosophy into what we would call neuroscience today. And that, of course, is reductive. It doesn't account for the uniqueness of the human being as body and soul, mind and matter. But it was a very influential move that Kant made. Also, he has this dream that he writes about in an essay called Perpetual Peace, in which he posits that if only the nations of the world would govern themselves according to the dictates of pure reason, then there would be no more wars. And we would have a perpetual peace, a heaven on earth. He explicitly...
But he was a believer, right?
Yeah, he was a rationalist believer in Jesus Christ without miracles, I think.
Okay.
And he's responsible, I think, for the optimism that surrounds the Enlightenment, that if we just get rid of those cranky Christians who are holding us back and clinging to medieval ways, we'll make a perfect society.
Yeah.
And that's the dream that died absolutely horribly in World Wars I and II, because it was precisely those nations who were at the center of Enlightenment, France, Germany, England, the U.S., that bombed the out of each other and used those great advances in technology and science to destroy entire peoples in the Holocaust and millions of soldiers and innocent people. So, I mean, that got a little far afield of Kant, but he is very much the father of philosophy understood today as analytics, as neuroscience.
Yeah, so still very influential today.
Oh, absolutely.
Frederick Nietzsche died 1900, German. Father was a pastor. He very much turned away from Christianity, though. Didn't like Christianity very much. But very influential, though, huh?
Oh, absolutely. If his lineage, he takes some things from Hegel and a fellow named Arthur Schopenhauer. In Schopenhauer's big thing is the will, not reason, is the mover of history and peoples. And Nietzsche, adopts that as the slogan, the will to power.
Yeah.
So for him, as a radical individual who really hated what the Enlightenment did and hated Christians even more, the will to power of the Superman, the Übermensch, was required to assert itself and to upend the values that Christians, the Jews and Christians, had distorted by making the meek the inheritors of the earth and the strong-willed people the ones who were proud and needed to repent and convert. Nietzsche wanted to upend that. He always remained fascinated by Christ, though.
Yeah.
And ultimately, one theory about why he went insane, other than the syphilis thing, was that he couldn't reconcile his own understanding of the Übermensch with the figure of Christ.
Yeah.
Christ always came out superior to him. He writes about Christ all the time in
Zarathustra.
Zarathustra.
Like a fascination with him, but it almost seems like if he believed that Christ was divine and died, he had all the power, but he didn't use it. He allowed himself to die. It would be like the exact opposite of what Nietzsche would say, because if you got the power, you got to use it, right?
Yeah.
And kind of push your will through, and Jesus didn't do that. He
Exactly.
did the exact opposite. And
Exactly.
So, hence the. All right, one more. Hegel.
Gosh.
Hegelian dialectic, influence on Marx.
I think of Hegel in connection with evolution, frankly. He has this idea of the gradual unfolding of Geist, of spirit, throughout human history. And he sees a progression in the unfolding of Geist. You need to begin with the realm of faith, but at a certain point in the timeline of human history, conveniently it was in his person, Geist is fully unveiled, and you have the fullness of enlightened idealism in him. And that idea of a progress and evolution obviously comes in a little later in the biological realm with Darwin, but it's still very influential in theology, even in biblical studies, where you're looking for the progression from the more simple to the more complex.
Yeah.
And what happens often is philosophers and theologians will impose this dialectical model or evolutionary model in inappropriate ways to distort the mystery of Christ or the creation of the New Testament, the writing of the Gospels, whatever it might be.
Yeah. It's interesting. Some people accuse Nietzsche of influencing Hitler, Nietzsche, I think, did have a sister who was a Nazi.
She was the rabid Nazi.
There was some debate about whether Nietzsche would have, been in favor of Hitler. But without a doubt, Marx was influenced by Hegel.
Yes.
From a very, economics, materialistic kind of standpoint. Lenin
sure.
would have been influenced by Hegel. So, I mean, ideas have consequences.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, look, today, I tend to think that the average person, we talked about St. Paul and his audience, the average person today, if you pick out 100 people at the mall and you say the same kind of thing that I'm firing off at you right now and just saying, Nietzsche, Hegel, I don't think they would have a clue, but those
they've
men,
imbibed the ideas.
Yeah, right. So the ideas are alive and well, but people don't know from whence they came,
Sure.
which that's why I think these kind of conversations are important.
Agreed.
To have. All right, let me ask you. Last week when I had Dr. Howell, I asked him the question of who, for good or for bad, is the most influential philosopher in the world today. Of course, it doesn't have to be alive. It could have lived 1,000 years ago. As you look at the landscape of the world, who's not counting Jesus? Okay, it's got to be somebody not divine, but who comes to mind? And then I'll tell you who Dr. Howell said, who I think may surprise you. You probably won't say the same person, I'm guessing.
Well, we've been focusing so much on the West. I mean, the one that comes to mind, honestly, is the Buddha.
Oh, really?
Wow. From the East. But in Western philosophy, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
I'm inclined to say Hegel.
Oh, yeah?
Even though I think the winner would have to be Descartes.
Oh, really?
Simply because of the massive shift that he causes to set everything, both for good and for ill, in motion.
Yeah.
Because it's with Descartes and Francis Bacon that you do get the machinery for the amazing advances in technology that we enjoy today.
Yeah.
From medicine to cars to planes.
Right.
And so there are very definite good things that have come from that shift.
Yeah.
But there are also, the unfortunate outcomes of materialism and a refusal even to consider a supernatural. Maybe the other answer I could give would be Heidegger, Martin Heidegger.
Yeah. He was a Nazi, right?
Yes, and never repented of it.
Never did. Okay.
But he had an amazing influence on metaphysics. Understood.
Existentialist? What was he?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Existential metaphysics that doesn't allow a discussion of God in the metaphysics.
So atheist.
So he frames metaphysics in such a way as to exclude questions of God.
So I see now. Last interview I asked you your favorite, and you gave me 3, and this time I said most influential, and you gave me 3.
I'm just trying to be consistent.
You're very Trinitarian, aren't you?
That's right. Yes, indeed.
No, that's great. I appreciate it. I told you that I would mention Dr. Howell, who he said last week. He said Ayn Rand. Are you familiar with her?
Yes, I've never really read her stuff.
No,
but,
okay. Just from a political,
practical and political perspective.
Yeah, which I wasn't surprising that, and it also goes back to our conversation about female philosophers, because she is one of the more influential, and like you said, Edith Stein, a brilliant philosopher as well. Well, this has been a great conversation. I appreciate it very much. So what did we accomplish? Jesus, St. Paul, and John were to some degree philosophers, and then also a great discussion about a lot of other philosophers as well. So thank you very much for taking some time to talk about what I enjoy talking about. I could do this all night.
This is fun. This is fun for sure.
And so anyways, thank you also to my dear daughter, Maura, who has been running the board, so to speak, and moving the cameras back and forth. And so thank you for her taking some time to do this. And thank you for watching. Be sure to comment below if you have any questions. I'm sure Father Thomas will go back on the YouTube channel and look at maybe some of the comments and respond if there are direct questions to him about anything that he spoke about. And again, he is from Our Lady of Dallas Cistercian Abbey. They also have a school there. What, 4th to 12th grade? Is that what it is? Fifth through 12th grade. Okay, Cistercian High School, one of the, if not the best school in Texas. You might agree.
I'm biased, certainly, but you're right. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. God bless you.